I'm Shani Pierre, and I'm the new director at the Maison Française, and I'd like to welcome you to today's panel discussion on the U.S. and the European Union in a time of change. Is Obama's victory misunderstood in Europe? With Walter Russell Mead and Yannick Mireur, and the discussion will be moderated by Charlie Cobb from the Committee for Economic Development. I'd like to first thank our co-sponsor of this event, the French-American Foundation, whose president Antoine Troy is here as well, and to thank in particular Joanna Kohler, who's Director of Policy Programs and who proposed this event and proposed that we co-sponsor it together with the French-American Foundation. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion and that you come back for more events soon. We have brochures with upcoming events outside. We have, on October 28th, for example, a conversation on the work of Marcel Proust with Antoine Compagnon and Adam Gopnik, also co-sponsored with the French-American Foundation. So please enjoy today, pick up a brochure on your way out, and come back soon. And I will turn over to Joanna Kohler, who's going to introduce Charlie Cobb.
Thank you for your kind words, Shani. I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator, Charles Kolb, who is the president of CED, the Committee for Economic Development. CED is a business-led public policy organization that was created in the 1940s and helped design the Marshall Plan. Today, CED works on issues such as healthcare, education, campaign finance reform, and trade policy, among other important topics. Before joining CED, Charlie worked at United Way of America, he was general counsel. He helped clean up the scandal that they had there in the 1990s. Before that, he spent 10 years in government, ending up in the first Bush White House, where he served as deputy assistant to the president for domestic policy. And I will just finish by saying that Charlie is a great Francophile. And I will now leave the floor to you to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
This here soon. Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you, Shani. Welcome to everyone who is here. Thank you all for attending what I think will be a very interesting, engaging, and thoughtful discussion. Just a couple of words about Shani Pierre and the Maison Française. It's been my pleasure to have known Shani for a number of years. I think the first time we worked together was back on a forum you were doing at the French-American Foundation on healthcare, and the topic was what can the United States learn from the French experience. And so I've been very pleased to follow Shani's career, and she has now recently this fall taken over the helm of the Maison Française. I know she has lots of ideas, and they've got a great leader here, and it will be fun, and it will be good for Colombia and the Maison Française. So Shani, congratulations. And Joanna, thank you very much for your introduction. I must confess that before I was a moderator, I was a midwife. And I think what I mean by that is, I won't share the story, Yannick knows it, but we actually met some months ago through a mutual friend, and I think I was indirectly responsible for introducing Yannick to Joanna at the foundation, and so sort of one thing led to another, and this program evolved. So anyway, so such is my role as a midwife. So Yannick, it's good to see you. So now I will switch to my role as a moderator, and it's an honor to introduce two people who are intellectually brilliant and people that I have admired and whose writings I have read. We're going to go in this order, starting with Walter Russell Mead and then Yannick. Walter Russell Mead is the Henry Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York, and one of the country's leading students of American foreign policy. He's written a number of books. I've been privileged to read him for many years in Foreign Affairs and other magazines, and real pleasure to meet you today, Walter. His book, Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, was published by Knopf in 2001 and has also received a number of awards around the world, including the Lionel Gelber Award for the best book in English on international relations in 2002. His newest book is called God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World, also published by Knopf in 2007. He's written for every publication you can think of in this country, and has focused on a number of issues that are very important to our country and the world in which our country has to exist. He teaches in addition to his writing, and it's a real pleasure to have you here and to meet you. And Yannick Mireur is a political scientist and an international affairs specialist who focuses on U.S. politics and foreign relations. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of Politique Américaine, which is the leading French journal on U.S. affairs. And his newest book, which I've had a chance to take a look at in English, it is called After Bush, that's the W. Bush. After Bush, Why America Will Not Change, with an introduction by Mireur. And it's quite well done. And very pleased that you wrote it. What I didn't know was that you had worked for some years with Dan Jurgen at Cambridge Energy Research Associates. So Yannick brings a remarkable combination of skills in both energy and defense issues, as well as U.S. and global policy issues. He is focused on topics such as how American capitalism influences U.S. foreign policies. I'm particularly interested in what you think American capitalism is right now, because we've had some issues. So I told Shani and Joanna I'm not a shy moderator, so here's the game plan. Our speakers are going to go each for 12 to 15 minutes each, and then I will try and pose some questions to both of them to get a dialogue going, but you should be thinking about questions that you might want to ask, and I've been known to call on people at random. So this is a university, so you know the drill. We're going to start now with Walter.
Great. Well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to Maison Française and the French-American Foundation for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and certainly share a platform with Yannick, whose work I also admire. Did the Europeans misunderstand Obama's election? I think in some ways that's the second question, because the first question may be, did Americans misunderstand Obama's election? And I think to some degree they did, we did. That is, and certainly the administration did. I think there's a strong belief in the administration, particularly against the background of the acute financial panic at the time of the inauguration, that the election of 2008 was one of those transformative elections, like the election of 1932, that usher out one period in American history and usher in another. And that the president had a transformational mandate, that people had really, just as the same way in 1932, Americans had grown indescribably weary of the pieties and orthodoxies of the 1920s and wanted something quite different. So President Obama, like President Roosevelt, could now preside over a deep transformation of the country's culture and politics. I think more and more it looks like his mandate was a little bit more like Bill Clinton's in 1992. That is, people were, while there were a lot of people who were sick and tired of the ideas of American conservatism, there were probably the voters who put him in office and who will keep him there were people who thought that they wanted the system managed better, and that they'd lost confidence in the Republicans as stewards of the system, but that they were not necessarily looking for a restructuring of the United States. I think part of what we've seen politically in the U.S. since January has been President Obama sort of coming to grips with this change. We'll see where it goes. I think he has an opportunity to teach and to maybe build a constituency for a transformative presidency, but he'll have to do that step by step rather than being able to get it all done at once. The Europeans, I think, shared these illusions that were widespread among Americans, but also had some other errors of their own. And this may be worth talking about to kind of encapsulate some of the problems that we see cropping up in U.S. European relations now, I think it's actually worth looking at French-U.S. relations, which are passing through one of their all too frequent low points at the moment. Not lowest of the low, but definitely as one reads from Paris, there is a certain acerbic quality to the assessments of President Obama's statesmanship of late. I understand a panel is planned soon for "Is Obama a Weak President?" in Paris. So if we look at what why President Sarkozy should suddenly feel the need to let many of his close advisors, associates, and the international press know that he has some problems with Obama's leadership, we can see, I think, a pattern on Obama's side of ways in which statements by the American president really crossed important French interests. The first being the statement on the abolition of nuclear weapons at the United Nations General Assembly. For France, the possession of nuclear weapons is not an evil, it is a good. It's an important part of the country's independent posture in world affairs. It's a constitutive element of France's claims to great power stature. Delegitimizing nuclear weapons is not a popular thing to do. Number two, we then find the U.S. Treasury Department saying, you know, the G7 is really no longer that important. It's going to be basically the G20 from here on out. We are moving rather quickly to take a small elite club in which France is a leading member and replace it with a much larger grouping in which France is perhaps in the second tier of members politically, if not necessarily economically yet. And finally, we have the call from the Treasury Department that among the needed reforms of the IMF Board of Directors would be the abolition of the French Directorate at the IMF. What I think was particularly annoying, perhaps, or would annoy me if I were French, and so I suspect it also annoyed the French, is that this was not a this sort of triple whammy, we might say, was not a calculated insult. It was an uncalculated insult. That is to say, behind all of these decisions, it's fairly clear that there was no one in the senior circle in the White House suggesting to President Obama that while all of these might be wise policy choices, if you're going to roll them out in a short period of time, you ought to think about how you do it and perhaps consult and discuss before you act. And so what we see, I think, is that it's not so much an ideological hostility toward Europe or toward France that might have been expressed in a recent administration, but a studied indifference to relations with France. A sense that that's not where the big, that when you're thinking about big issues in American policy in world terms, there are a number of telephone numbers that you don't need to call, and one of them takes you to the Elysee. So, this, I think, gets us to where many Europeans hoped that Barack Obama's election would make a turn in U.S.-EU relations based not on atmospherics, but on closer consultation and coordination of policy. And I think so far this has not borne fruit. From the Obama administration's point of view, in fairness, it's safe to say that when they've asked for help, Europe, particularly on Afghanistan, Europe has not been particularly forthcoming, nor perhaps can it be. But again, from the American administration's point of view, there's the sense that the difference between the Europeans helping you and the Europeans hurting you is maybe not so great. And therefore, the time one spends on European relations should be proportionate to that fact. Now, I think that's wrong. I think it's a mistake. But I think we are seeing in the Obama administration, not even at the level of conscious intent, but much more powerfully at the level of unconscious assumptions, this vision has taken hold. looking forward, I think we are going to see that the Obama administration, like the Bush administration, indeed like all American administrations, has to confront a key problem. And that is that as the world is changing, influence, power, and energy seem to be passing from Europe to Asia. And that the American position in the world is changed by this, but not altered, if that makes any sense. That is, that the U.S. is still the sort of a unique global power in the international system. But while its Atlantic relations were the core of its international strategy and relations in the 21st century, the Pacific is likely to be the core of the American project in the 21st century, whatever that turns out to be. And furthermore, because the U.S. is deeply concerned with, and Obama more than Bush, with the health of international institutions and their workability, that means that the U.S. is going to have on its policy agenda the task of reducing Europe's voice and place in international institutions in order to make way, first of all, for more Asian voices and influence, and in the second order, more generally, for other emerging developing world powers like Brazil. And this, the U.S. doesn't want to accelerate this. It regrets, I think, on the whole, the necessity for doing it. But to the extent that Americans are internationalists and multilateralists, that will not make them as instinctively Atlanticist in the future as it did in the past. And I think to some degree there was a sense, a hope in Europe in any case, that with the election of a multilateralist American president, we would be going back to the days in which multilateralism in America primarily meant, and almost indeed exclusively meant, relations with the great European powers. I don't think that's what Obama believes multilateralism is. I think Japan, China, India. I'm actually reminded, and maybe I'll close with this observation, something that Henry Kissinger once said to me. I think he said it to other people too. I don't claim any unique authority for this, but he said, if you look at world geopolitics, the consolidation of the European Union is less important than the unification of Germany. The unification of Germany is less important than the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the fall of the Soviet Union is less important than the rise of India and China. And I think the assumptions and world outlook behind that statement are likely to permeate American foreign policy going forward. And this means for both Europeans and Americans a need to rethink our relations. I continue to believe that a strong Euro-American relationship is one of the fundamental building blocks of world order. But we have to think intelligently and clearly among ourselves and with one another. What does that mean in a new century and with a new geopolitical map of the world emerging?
Thank you very much.
So Walter, you mentioned Henry Kissinger and perceptions of most important events in recent history, and in fact, to answer the questions of does Europe misunderstand Obama's victory, I'd say they might even have misunderstood it twice. If I look at the current polemic about the qualities of leadership of the U.S. president. And so one of the elements for that is, of course, the perceptions, including the historical perceptions that the Europeans have about America. And so I will perhaps, instead of leave that for the Q&As, but go back and to give some kind of a historical perspective a little bit. And that goes back to the main themes of the book. To me, Henry Kissinger said about JFK, I think is greatly overrated, which in fact I agree with. And that has to do precisely with the perceptions that the Europeans have on America, American presidents, republicanism, and the Democratic Party in the U.S. There were two themes, in fact, that did prompt me to write this. The first one, back in 2007, when Iraq was a dominant theme in international politics, and everything American had to be analyzed through the question of the war in Iraq and the war on terror more generally. I thought that, first point, Iraq in 2008 would not be, and war would not be the prime issue of the elections, because there was this unseen, unanalyzed, totally overlooked, growing anxiety of the middle class in America about the future of the economy and jobs. That was, of course, vindicated then with the economic crisis, but at the time was not particularly predictable, at least in terms of magnitude. That was point number one. Therefore, that social and economic issues and the reinvention of the social contract in America would be the growing theme moving up towards the election in 2008. The second point, which is perhaps a contradiction with the first one, to some degree, was that despite George W. Bush and the despicable opinion that Europeans generally and overwhelmingly, in fact, had of the US president from a number of perspectives, that despite that, it was not obvious at all that a Democratic candidate would win the election in 2008. And that has to do perhaps with the subtitle of the book, Why America Will Not Change, in the sense that a good Republican candidate could perfectly succeed despite the GOP being in shambles to George W. Bush in 2008. To some degree, there was one condition for that, of course, and that was that a Republican candidate would be unconventional enough and would also be sensitive to the first point, that is to say, to not only to security, national security issues, but also have a new perspective, a rejuvenate, so to speak, the compassionate conservatism claimed by George W. Bush in 2000, and be attentive and sensitive to social and economic issues. And in that sense, there would be some kind of a convergence toward the center from the Republican candidate and the Democratic one, when it was a little more obvious that Obama had a pretty good chance, which was not at all predictable at the beginning, especially in the primary process, that he would have a chance to make it, to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. In their respective speeches, one could see that there was a convergence of the two candidates toward the center. And in a sense, John McCain sort of answered the profile of the candidate and the only candidate able to win the White House in 2008. Anti-Bush, totally unconventional, and having, which is the historical perspective I wanted to mention, having Theodore Roosevelt as some kind of a model, in the sense that the convergence toward the center would be the legacy of progressivism in American politics. And progressivism in American politics, that's also a European perspective that the Europeans often miss, is not a monopoly of the Democratic Party, but was invented as a political party by a Republican president, a little unconventional and a little maverick like John McCain was. In fact, John McCain claimed that his hero in American politics was Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican president who, in fact, sort of opened new windows in American politics, and these windows have been opened wide by his distant cousin, the Democratic president, FDR, that, of course, everyone knows in Europe. The Roosevelt images in Europe, of course, a turnaround FDR, but TR is often overlooked, when in fact it tells you a lot about American politics and the historical development for progressivism in American politics. So we had in 2008, at the end of the day, two candidates marching toward some sort of a center, conscious of the fact that something had to be done, not only in national security matters, but also as far as the social contract in America was concerned. Then, of course, there was the unpredictable, which was the Lehman Brothers episode, the crisis, and the mismanagement of both the campaign and the crisis itself by the Republican candidate, who said 3 times that the fundamentals were good, when in fact Obama had a very pedagogical and simple message to say we have to avoid a crisis of credit, because a crisis of credit will lead to a crisis of confidence, and that worst thing we're going to have to face. And therefore then you had Obama's election, which the Europeans misunderstood, in the sense that, as I said, because of this march toward a new center, there would be a bipartisan, at least in spirit, if not in action. In action is quite difficult, and we see this now. But a march toward a new American consensus, in a way, McCain coming from the right, if you wish, and Obama coming from the left, so to speak. The Europeans misunderstood that in the sense that there would be a legacy of conservatism in in Obama's actions, in Obama's policies. He had inherited a reformed Democratic Party, adherent to budget balance, adherent to very cautious discourse on the freedom of guns, on abortion, and there was there what we would call in Europe a center-right candidate more than leftist candidates. I think this was greatly overlooked, and that has been infused in the discourses and in the actions and the first steps of Obama's policy domestically. And to finish on this, and to conclude, I said the Europeans to some degree have greatly overlooked that, analyzing the election through national security issues primarily. But to some degree, they've also misunderstood, and that was I was saying they've misunderstood it twice, because I'm not sure that the style, if you wish, of the president means that he is weak. And we'll have an occasion, of course, to discuss that with the French-American perspective that you've introduced in your remarks. There is much to do about this leadership issue. I think the leadership style of the French president and the American president is extremely different. We have someone who is enormously energetic, prompt to action, and we have someone here in the US who is a thinking American, who is a cerebral president, who analyzes things perhaps a little bit too much. So there is a contradiction in saying that he doesn't take action, and at the same time he's not wise because he doesn't listen to advices, when in fact he actually takes some time to weigh arguments in order to try to find the best way. That's the way I feel about it. Try to find the best way to implement a vision that is a long-term vision, that may be in contradiction with immediate interest, with immediate perceptions by the Americans themselves, but that are meant to fulfill long-term objectives that are transformative, that are historical because of their reach. And I believe these are not only national security matters, taking into account the shifting of cards, and clearly I agree with you, the shift of power, influence, and energy to Asia that the Europeans also overlooked a little too much. But, and that would be the last point, I think trying to reinvent an American project, including domestically, that is to say, and I think everyone, the healthcare debate vindicates that. Everyone is conscious of the fact that something has to be done. What is another question, but something has to be done to reinvent a social contract that could be as sustainable as the social contract that was created by the New Deal and NFDR. It's very short.
That's very good. Thank you, Yannick. I want to start by picking up on a point which Walter raised and which Yannick just talked about, and that is the apparent shift of focus of the United States away from Europe towards these rising centers in Asia, including India and also Brazil. If you kind of go back and look at our history, we as a country have had a whole lot more in common in terms of our heritage, our values with Europe. How much of this shift is driven by economics, and how much of it ultimately may be driven by currency? And let me tell you why I say currency. There used to be a reserve currency for the world called the pound sterling. And that changed for a number of reasons, as did the British Empire. We now have had for a number of decades a reserve currency for better as well as for worse in the US dollar. We've got competition from the euro. We got the Chinese saying, well, wait a second, folks, we've got a currency too. Maybe we should reweight the market basket, and rather than have a reserve currency of just the dollar, maybe we ought to put the dollar and the euro and the renminbi. How much of this is driven by economics, or are we going to jettison all the things that we have in common with Western Europe and France?
Well, I think for one thing, the culture and heritage question isn't as determinative as people say, because Japan has been part of the West now since the 1950s, really. So it has more to do, I think, with level of development and other social issues rather than in other words, it's a future-oriented community rather than a past-oriented community of blood. And then if one looks at ties with India, actually U.S.-India ties rest on a common heritage of British colonialism. India uses common law. I mean, actually, Lord Macaulay wrote what remains the core of the Indian Civil Code. I once, as many of you know, Singapore is a place where people talk a lot about the clash between Eastern values and Western values. At one point I was talking to the person who at the time was acting as the spokesperson for this Singaporean view. And in private, as I got to know him a little better, he told me he was a devout Roman Catholic. And he believed that actually part of Singapore's prosperity might be part of God's plan to bring Christianity to China. And so I'm not quite sure what we mean about Asian values when and how that differs from our own. So I think these heritage questions are less important. Also, I have to say, from the American point of view, and this sometimes is hard for Europeans to understand, what little legitimacy we sometimes manage to claim in the rest of the world is often enhanced rather than diminished by our status as a non-European country. And that to some degree, the closer the United States, there's a sort of a European vision sometimes, I feel, which was that in the world today, the US and Europe will be the power couple. America will be the dad who sends Iran upstairs to bed without any dinner when it's misbehaved. And Europe will be the mom who then brings a tray of milk and cookies up a little later. And that Europe will be the soft power parent and America will be the hard power parent, but Europe will be a parent and America will be a parent. Okay. This is not a very popular vision of the world in Asia. And in fact, it is entirely necessary from the standpoint of America's world position for us to conduct ourselves in a way in which that is clearly not a perception that we're helping. So there is a necessary differentiation. The West, as a concept, has actually, in some ways, becomes a negative factor in terms of the projection of American influence in the world. That doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as the West, or that there aren't ways in which it's easier for an American to talk to a German or a Frenchman or a Brit than it is for us to reach a meeting of a mind with people from very different cultures. That all remains true. But its impact on policy is going to be something that is maybe difficult to quantify going forward.
But do you realize that Uncle Sam is a polygam? Because the question is, you have many wives in Europe. That makes the thing difficult for us. And
right.
We often disagree, you know, so which of the wife is going to bring the cookies upstairs?
Exactly, right.
That's the thing.
Right. Well, the news is we have a girl in every port.
Perhaps that facilitates some operations, but we have to think together nonetheless.
Right. The internet and instantaneous communications have become a problem for the U.S. because all the girls in all the different ports can compare notes. But this is where we are, I think.
That leads to one question that is often overlooked and not, if you wish, analyzed as such directly, which is this the end of the Western world?
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, historically, the great shift of money, power, and etc. to Asia is a matter of fact, and it's a historical shift. Now, shift is like cruises. Of course, they're not sudden. It takes time before the cruiser changes its direction. It's going to be a little bit of the same with the currency issue. It's going to be the same with the global institutions, that in fact the Chinese, for instance, which is much more important than Singapore in that particular case, tend to show that they agree with this so-called stakeholder approach to China, coined by Robert Zillick, that means which consists in saying that we have to co-opt China into the global institutions, rules, practices, and principles of international actions as set out by the Americans at the end of World War II. But much overlooked is the fact that how important it is to, because it is still time to do so, to forge the future balance of institutions, principles. The Westerners, the Americans, however weakened, and the Europeans, however divided, have an historical chance to accompany that shift and in fact move forward before others. And in that sense, I think point number one, it is important to think together about what it means about the future of the Western world, what is the end of the Western world, how we can deal with it. And point number two, it means that I a little disagree with your analysis of the, not that I want to talk about France particularly, but the example of Sarkozy, of the French being annoyed possibly by the fact that they would have less influence than before if we shift from the G7 to the G something, and so on. I believe that first of all, the French president, because he's very energetic into action, he said, okay, we have to change things, let's change them, you know. As proposed that when he holds the presidency of the G7 or 8, we'll invite other countries, India, Brazil, China, to the new G something. So the debate is about, is it going to be 14, 12, or 20? So I think that is not a way, in fact, to diminish your influence, but just to take stock of changing balance of power, acting on it, being proactive, and contributing to the actual change of things instead of just talking endlessly about the reform of the UN Security Council and the reform of global institutions. You just propose and act on them. That is, for me, a way to have influence.
When will France propose that it and Britain give up its Security Council seats in favor of an all-European permanent seat on the...
But I don't think it is necessary that we have to shift with the two. That's a little bit of a technical thing, but we don't necessarily have to go with replace the Brits and the French with an EU one. That we can enlarge to others without just. We should rather invite Germany, in fact, to have a third European. That would be a wiser way.
Well, that would actually be the fourth, including Russia. The fourth European state. Right now, 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are European countries, and 3 of the 5, and those 3 are all former great powers. This actually is probably something that will not be no longer the case in 100 years, and probably even less. But how do we make the change? And I think the UN will be, you cannot have an effective United Nations whose fundamental constitution reflects what even by the standards of 60 years ago was the courtesy admission of France to the Security Council. And so, I agree with you, Yannick, that one needs to be proactive here. I'm not sure that Europeans have yet as a group come to terms with the need to develop a joint strategy for the reduction of Europe's footprint in global institutions.
I totally agree with you. You don't even have to go that far. They haven't agreed on something that is fundamental, and I think is a preliminary step to contemplating their future and the future of the Western community, which is their relation with Russia. As a matter of fact, I organized last week in Washington a talk with US policymakers, Europeans, and corporate executives as well, a little seminar on Western-Russian relations. One of the most striking elements of the discussions were the fact that we have to sort of, this is some kind of an agreement on a wide array of issues, but the misperceptions and the chain reactions of misaction, misperceptions, defiance, suspicion, and so on, we know all that defines Western-Russian relations, all of that defined them for 15 years, is the most important impediment to enacting a vision of what the future of relation between Russians, Europeans, Western Europeans, or EU, and the US ought to be, because that is a preliminary step towards tackling the issues you've just mentioned. So we sort of agree from different angles.
Let me ask, how much does the United States or Barack Obama right now need Western Europe or Europe in dealing with Iran? You talked, Walter, you alluded to an effective United Nations, and I thought you were going to put the period at one point in the sentence, but you didn't and continue. I'm not sure that I've seen an effective United Nations. It certainly has not been effective in dealing with the Iran problem. So to what extent, I mean, China is a problem. Russia is a problem in dealing with Iran. So you're Barack Obama, you're sitting in the Situation Room, you're surrounded by all of your advisors. Where does he turn? How much does he need Western Europe in dealing with what is a potentially very, very serious problem, which some people have said if retaliatory action is taken, you basically could have a conflagration in the Middle East?
Well, I think, again, I think for Barack Obama, really the core question is, in his own mind, that he has to answer is, which is worse, an Iranian nuclear weapon or a U.S.-Iranian conflict? I think we all hope and pray that sanctions and diplomacy might avoid that stark choice. But I think there are not many people out there who are very hopeful that we will be spared that choice. If I had to guess what the president is thinking, and I don't know, I would guess that he thinks that the military conflict is worse and that his instincts would lead him to want to find a path to contain Iran through developing closer relations with Arab countries and so on and so forth. If that's his course, or Western European support is of great importance if there's going to be a war with Iran. But we probably won't get it.
But wouldn't it also be
And if you're well, I'm saying if you think that sanctions will really work, then Western Europe is important. But I don't think anybody really thinks that the solution to this crisis will come from effective sanctions on Iran. I think people think that that's something that one does while one plays out the larger question of how to deal with it. So in that sense, a lot of the discussion between the U.S. and Western European countries is about something symbolic rather than, not that, again, I'm not a neoconservative and symbolism is empty, we shouldn't deal with it, but it's something of a second order issue. And that when Obama sits down and asks himself, which is worse, a bomb or a war, I actually doubt that his relations with Western Europe are a big factor in that, or rather that the possibility of getting support from Western Europe in a war is one that is a significant factor in his thinking.
But you're assuming that bomb just sits in a warehouse somewhere.
Well, again, I'm not making any. I think, again, if the core policy question, I think, is one that an Obama administration will think it needs to be made by the president sitting in the Oval Office. And then in terms of how do you implement whatever it is that you want to do, you begin to work with your friends and allies, and your enemies for that matter. But I'm not, it's hard to see, Europe out of its own interests, regardless of the state of its relations with the U.S., will try to be on the side of making sure that if the Iranians have a bomb, they don't slip little ones to various terror groups and so on. Just as even at the worst moments of U.S.-European relations in the Bush administration, the very close counterintelligence, counterterrorism cooperation actually significantly deepened, even as these spats went on.
Yeah, I think, take your example, when it is a matter of war and peace, I think presidents decide with their own conscience. I think Chirac didn't take too much into account the future of U.S.-American relations, Franco-American relations, sorry, when he had to decide whether, between the two options, whether a war or just elusive weapons of mass destruction at the time.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of the same thing. I'd say, though, that I agree with you that it seems probably that the war is the worst option. Obama thinks the war is the worst option. He would still need the Europeans, but above all, he would need the Russians And in that sense, we go back to the question that I've raised before, which is the triangle relationship between Russia, Europe, and the US. In that sense, the missile defense decision to just abandon the plan, I think, is comforting. We'll see what the payback, so to speak, because obviously there will be a payback. We will see that in the wording of possible sanctions at the Security Council that will be supported by Russia. But as far as the heart of the matter is concerned, I'd say that it's more the sustainability, the future of the regime, and perhaps the hope, perhaps a vain hope, to accompany with European diplomacy and great Russian support a softening step by step of the regime in Iran, a transformation of that regime that is totally exhausted and completely divided. It's very complicated to find the real nucleus of power in the Iranian regime beyond the supreme guide. There are other interests at stakes, and in particular the economic interests of the ruling elite that makes business and who's probably opening up to the West and to America in particular would be detrimental to them. So that's an internal impediment that should not be overlooked. So I think it's more thinking about the future of the regime and what we can do together to sort of shift it towards something more amenable or more acceptable than the bomb itself. The real issue with the bomb, the real issue is terrorism is not Iran, it's Pakistan, which is extremely difficult to solve, where the Europeans have very little influence. And a war with Iran would be a disaster for 1,000 years, given the situation in the Middle East. And you cannot isolate too much the problem. You have to have I'd say, a regional approach to it. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and American relations with Israel, and the question of the settlements that the president himself has raised as the most difficult obstacle to any kind of progress in the peace negotiations, if negotiations there are.
I would also just throw in another place where U.S.-EU relations could be important and could be vulnerable, and that would be the question of Turkey. Because I think it's, to my mind, it's fairly likely that if Iran has a bomb at some point in the not-too-distant future, Turkey would also move in that direction. And if you add to that the sense that we get both from France and Germany that Turkey's road to membership in the EU is blocked, I think Europe might find itself with a hostile nuclear Turkey on its Balkan frontier, one which would actively, in pursuing a more Ottoman foreign policy, seek to re-engage with Arab neighbors and so on, and actually compete against European and to some degree American influence in the region.
An Ottoman policy by the Turks, if that is a very elegant way to put it, although I think we're far from it, but would not necessarily be in contradiction with European influence and the working relationship between
if it's
the
an
Europeans
angry,
and the Turks.
vindictive Turkey that feels it's been shunned by the
Precisely.
European Union, which it will be if it's not a member, I predict. And I think virtually every serious observer of Turkey would agree that if Turkey feels rejected and is culturally insulted by being clearly placed outside the circle by Europe, the Turkish culture, mentality, historical experience is such that we will all be regretting this for decades, And my guess, too, is that that will be the view of the U.S. establishment of the European decision. And it will be, when the U.S. advocates Turkish membership in the European Union, this is not a throwaway line. This actually represents a very, very serious U.S. view of what's in Europe's best interest and in America's best interest. And I think, I sometimes think there is a tendency in Europe to underestimate the serious potential for damage, structural damage in U.S.-European cooperation if we go to this point.
I'm not totally convinced about the regrettability of all this. I just think clearly the Europeans and Americans don't have the same view on Turkey's future. And you cannot not mention the timing of the possible inclusion of Turkey in an enlarged EU. That is also an important aspect of things. I think the Europeans have to do a common effort of laying out a new vision of their relations with Turkey, Since 1963, which is the Treaty of Friendship that opened up the perspective of Turkey entering into the EU, or the then community, there has been lots of hypocrisy about this, played by the European, and that indeed has a boomerang effect. I think they have to come out with the new ideas to assuage the fears of the Turks, who don't necessarily have, including a historical vocation, to be a full member of the EU institutions. I don't believe that. I think there are alternative ways, and the alternative is not just a clash of civilization to which no one believes in Europe. We are facing a clash of prosperities.
I think, again,
And
that's the European view. The Turks bitterly, I think the word is bitterly, resent it.
Because it depends the way it is managed.
No, it doesn't. It depends on what it is. There is no way you can put flowers on this and make the Turks think, you know, what do they say this about Bush's policy, you can't put lipstick on a pig.
Yeah.
And the Turks, you know, the Turks see the Europeans getting the makeup kit out, but they also see the pig.
Yeah. But fair enough. But you're very convinced. But I think they have an effort to do for adjusting their discourse to Turkey and the actions as well, including being innovative. That is to say, not reducing the question to only a question of membership to the EU, perhaps create a new thing. I mentioned that, in fact, in the book, which is the Ottoman.
Will they get membership?
I don't know about that. Maybe we won't see it in 10 years, 15, maybe they will in 30 years. In fact, my personal opinion, just my humble opinion on this, is on the short term, say 10, 15 years, impossible, no way, Jose, I think. However, if you have a more civilizational approach to international relations, in the order and the magnitude of the discussions we've had before, Western world, rising Asia, and so on, then the Ottoman model, the same way as the Austrian model, the Austrian Empire, and you have to go back to historical perspective is always fundamental to understand the present and sort of discuss the future. I mean, the destruction of the Ottoman Empire on the one hand, and the destruction of the Austrian one on the other, was the original scene, okay, of our current problems. So if you have a longer term perspective, say,
I feel the
maybe
ghost
40
of
years.
Woodrow Wilson not thanking you for that remark, but anyway.
Will they be admitted within 15 years?
I think the wise course, which I hope the Europeans will follow, is that I think the Turks have said over and over again they are inflexible on the substance, but they are extremely flexible on questions of timing. And I think an extended process, the Turks are willing to accept the idea that Turkish membership in the EU is a different order question from Croatian membership in the EU. Not so much, by the way, because of culture and religion, but because of size and impact. And so, and the Turks also do understand that joining the European Union would involve making further changes than they've already made in some Turkish institutions and practices. So for that reason, I think the Turks have always shown themselves open to a long-term, step-by-step process. But I think where the breaking point would be is that they need to be assured that that's the process that we're in and that the decision is irrevocable and we're moving to a phase of implementation of a decision. So I think a creative European diplomacy would look at how do we build on that flexibility. And those of us who spend time in Turkey are grateful for this kind of flexibility. We know that Turks don't always demonstrate this kind of flexibility on some issues. It's a sign, I think, of real maturity and real eagerness that they are willing to engage in this way. So let's hope that the Europeans will do it. It raises enormous problems. For Germans, there's the possibility that before too long, Germany won't have the largest membership, the largest population of any country in the EU. For France, I think there's an additional question of loss of influence within the EU and the EU being pulled east. So there are a number of issues that need to be raised. But Europe, in my mind, has gone too far to be able to draw back without serious consequences?
I don't think anyone would describe George W. Bush as an internationalist. It's somewhere I read, and Walter, you may have the correct number, I was just stunned to read that in his entire 8 years in the White House, he had something like 8 state dinners. I mean, it was in single digits. I mean, I was just stunned. I mean,
Well, he may have sent out more invitations. It's possible not everybody wanted to come.
No, but actually only eight formal, dinners with heads of state. I mean, these are fun things in Washington. If you read the Washington Post, there are 100 and some guests at each one of these things. It's a wonderful opportunity to project something about the United States, and particularly an interest in another country, that head of state. I was just stunned. And so now you have Obama, and I think part of what the European reaction and enthusiasm towards Obama was that we got possibly another chance. We have someone who doesn't look like most Americans, has a father who was from Kenya, a mother who was American, somebody who would be more open to the rest of the world. In the first 9 months of his presidency, though, he's had to focus on the U.S. economy, health care, a cap-and-trade bill, and Copenhagen, I guess, the Olympics. That's Chicago.
Copenhagen 1. Then there's Copenhagen 2,
right,
which would be equally
yeah.
unhappy.
Yeah. So most of his focus has been on domestic issues for the United States. So both of you have now been asked to be advisors to Barack Obama. What would you tell him he needs to do, not only to project that he really is an internationalist, but also not only to project, this is not PR, but to be sincere? What should he do? Because he doesn't, remember, he's a lawyer who grew up having read Saul Alinsky about Chicago politics and community organizing. So he's not an internationalist at heart. He's an internationalist perhaps by birth, but not by training or by experience. So what would you advise him?
Well, I actually think Harvard Law School is not a bad breeding ground for cosmopolitanism. I mean, I don't think he spent all of his time in the ward politics of Chicago. But look, one thing that I think it's, that from the standpoint of an American president, your time is the most valuable asset you have, and it's what is in the shortest supply, is the actual personal time of the President of the United States. And one's experience as a president is that everybody wants a piece of you. The President of the United States, as I once wrote, is a combination of Queen Elizabeth and Maggie Thatcher. He's the symbol of national unity, and he's the working head of government. So you have to get your picture taken with the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. If you have the Boy Scouts, you'd better have the Girl Scouts or you'll pay. And it's, all of these kinds of things. And it's amazing how much face time foreign leaders want with the President of the United States. If you look at all these summits, how many summits do they, and every time they want to, G7, G15, G20, G40, at all of which they want you to come and spend 3 days not really doing any work, but hello, how are you? And smiling for the cameras. So I think any president of the United States, when presented with the opportunity to spend 5 hours at a dinner for the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, is going to say, isn't there some other way? Now, I actually think there are a lot more uses you could put these state dinners to. I'm for state dinners. One of the things is that what a great way to reward campaign contributors. This is fantastic, and none of this embarrassing Bill Clinton putting them up in the Lincoln bedroom or something. This is perfectly straightforward, meet and greet with Queen Beatrix or whoever it might be. And they feel good, you look good, and so on. But it is a colossal waste of the president's time. Normally presidents feel.
So Bush should have done fewer?
Like I'm saying, I'm not sure. If he had done more, what would it have helped?
Well, I think, let me turn to you.
More lipstick on more pigs.
I don't agree with you, and I don't agree with you, except on one point. I do think the president's time is extremely valuable. But I think it was a very serious problem for George W. Bush that he was not seen as an internationalist. I think he did this country serious harm, and I say this as someone who worked for his father, who was an internationalist, who
But again,
understood the
I
importance of
agree with
protection.
these things, but how much better not to have adopted, not to have let everyone think you were introducing a radically new doctrine of preemptive war. That would have done more than 100,000 state dinners. So what I'm saying is, the problem with, I think it's a symptom that Bush maybe didn't do more in the state dinner. Clinton actually didn't do that many state dinners either. I once wrote that I thought he should do more. But it is, again, it's also in a time of domestic austerity. I have to say that I think there are a lot of unemployed auto workers and others with unemployment in the U.S. Obama is now looking into 2 years of these kinds of headlines.
Are you sounding like Jimmy Carter?
I'm just saying that there are a lot of Americans out there who look at this as, that in Animal Farm, when the pigs invite the neighboring farmers. Oh, I can't get pigs out of my head today. But the pigs invite the neighboring farmers over, and the pigs are all dressed up and with the farmers. A lavish state dinner for foreign dignitaries is not necessarily the signal an American president needs to send out.
It had to be lavish.
Well, what? Oh, fine. So Big Mac, we're ordering in Domino's.
Serve California wine.
That actually.
What would you advise Obama to do? And part of the question was also, what would you advise the president to do to project as an internationalist? Or maybe he shouldn't. Maybe it's not necessary.
Just a remark about the internationalist thing and George W. Bush and so on, because you mentioned Woodrow Wilson. I think the two presidents, in fact, one is remembered as an internationalist, that is Woodrow Wilson, as something very positive, when in fact he was just as Bush interested primarily, and as a scholar at Princeton, by domestic issues. W. Bush didn't pretend anything else when he, in fact, was elected president. They were both dragged into international affairs by wars, right? World War I and 9/11. The one, in fact, used the same principles, Woodrow Wilson, in order to create what was to become the United Nations later on. While Bush, that is with the peace as the main goal, while Bush used the same principles, American fundamental principles, to justify a war. Yeah. So that's they come from the same sort of thing, but one is sanguine, I would say, and the other one is very much into the intellect, just as Obama today. So I think Obama is also an internationalist by heart, more than by heart, perhaps by mind. I think his own reflections of his own condition as a black American, what you described it as not African American, but Kenya and so on, which comes down to the same, I guess, in terms of experience throughout the country during his life, if you wish. But his own thinking about himself, the question of identity, what's the idea that is America, and how should be his place in it, and so on. All this has fed his own thinking about what America should be as a project, which is an expression and a good expression that Walter uses in his book, The American Project, with the two coins, the two sides of the coin. That is to say, the domestic issues, the social contract, the coming together, the unity that was one of the main messages of his campaign, and how you project those principles abroad. I think is attention, sensitivity to the intricacies of international situations and the sometimes contradicting cultural currents that make a society. You mentioned Turkey, the hell of a place for that, right? I think that drives his thinking, so he seems sometimes a little bit hesitant because he's too construct, he's too cerebral. So there's a question of style, there is a question of method. And as far as the method is concerned, unlike Cheney and Bush, he's more like Reagan, and Theodore Roosevelt for that matter, understand the role of restraint, the role of cooperation, and the prime importance of a national institution and dialogue among cultures, one should say. The Cairo speech, the speech in Ankara, and a few others have shown that very clearly, that it is a question of method. He's been around for less than a year. I think you should give him time. But I think he is intellectually an internationalist.
Let's go to those of you in the audience who have been sitting patiently. I see lots of hands go up. We will start with this gentleman here. If you would tell us your name and your affiliation.
All right. Edouard Tétreault, with the French think tank called Institut Montaigne. And just passing by, we suggested notably that France shares its seat at the UN Security Council with Germany in order to build up a European seat. And my question is, you raised a fundamental question regarding the link of the transatlantic in 10 years' time, what will be the incentive for U.S. constituencies to elect a U.S. president to keep financing NATO bases in Germany, Spain, Poland, etc.? And if there is no incentive, what happens next?
Thank you.
I think that is an interesting question. I would expect that there would still be, the U.S. has been slowly repositioning forces away from Europe and into more active theaters. I think the establishment of an Africa command, basically moving Africa out of the European command in the American military and setting it up on its own is sort of a further step in this direction. Interestingly, this is also true in the State Department, where resources are being shifted away from Europe and toward other parts of the world, much to the distress of many of our career Foreign Service officers who are looking forward to that term as U.S. Consul General in Florence. Now they're going to Kano, and it's not the same. It's it is a question. I think probably the value of NATO in the American political consciousness is great enough that the repositioning would stop short of an absolute hollowing out of NATO. It's also true enough that geographically speaking, bases in Europe are useful enough to, for force projection further afield, that there would be additional arguments for keeping them there. So I would not actually think that would be a flashpoint, but it is worth thinking about.
No, not particularly. I overall subscribe to that. Yeah, I think it goes back to some of the questions, no particular additional comment. Just go back to the discussion we've had on coordination between U.S., Europe, Russia, that includes the future of NATO, and the Turkish side of the question is also sort of slightly introduced into the debate. But I think, by and large, I agree on that. I think, however, that the Europeans have to do a thinking effort, not only on the future Western world, but also on their support implication role in helping out the U.S. to manage balance of power in Asia. I was at the National Day of Korea. I was invited at an embassy in Paris, but it happened I was in Washington, D.C., so I went to the Washington embassy. No Euros around. Asian people, few Americans, no Euros around. Except perhaps the few who do their tour of duty to say hi to the foreign ambassador, right? But we overlook this region totally. Okay, we don't have to have the fifth fleet or the seventh fleet. I always get confused between the fleets. We have so many boats that in order to be influential there. And I think there is no, just as there is no Russian strategy from the EU, there is no Asian strategy for the EU, Northeast Asia in particular.
There's a lady over here, I think, who had a question.
Yeah, I'll just come late. I was in another lecture. My name is Weiss Blond, and I take classes here sometimes. And I'm just, I don't know exactly what you talked about in the lecture, but in general, there was an interesting perspective. I was reading something by Meacham on Andrew Jackson, who was the 7th President of the United States, and he was going on about the fact that Jackson had a very exciting campaign, and he was running for elections. And this was in the 1830s, and he was saying how foreign journalists who came to America and were viewing the campaign and the elections was saying how they felt that the American elections were quite different from the European system, and that people kept on talking about personality or emphasizing personality. It was a very emotionally driven campaign, and he said somehow the issues weren't that as important as the personality, the type of person that Andrew Jackson was, his previous successes, et cetera, and I think this has something to do with the dichotomy that transpires in the American political system, that when people are up for elections and they campaign, whoever the candidate is, it's very, there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of media and there's a lot of brass band kind of situation. And then when they actually ease into the presidency and they have to deal with political issues, sometimes the platform and the issues become slightly or very different from what the campaign was. And I think this is a particularly American phenomenon, or it happens in America more than it happens in other countries, like in Europe and overseas. Would you agree with this? I mean, in terms of, you know, how to deal with the American president after the election and what transpires as opposed to what the people or the world media are exposed to before they actually get elected.
Well, you actually, I think it may be a little bit more of a universal phenomenon. I don't remember, but I've been told that when Harold Macmillan became Prime Minister of the UK, a group of reporters were asking, you know, a reporter came up and said, Mr. Prime Minister, what will determine the policy of your government? And he responded, events, dear boy, events. And, you know, I think that's often the case for every political leader.
Well, I don't really think so, because so far, I don't think anything has happened in this presidency that is so phenomenally different from what happened, you know, before his election. I don't think anything has really transpired that is,
Well,
that is
the war in Afghanistan has gotten worse.
Yeah, but
Iran has a new facility. I mean, there will
that
be
actually
something.
looks like it's getting better.
But nevertheless, it's a change. So I think we'll continue to see more change.
Yes, sir. Can you tell us who you are?
I'm sorry. You got me right when I raise my Belgian chocolate.
I always do that. Try French chocolate.
Alfonso Diaz. My name is Alfonso Diaz. This question is addressed to Dr. Mead. And you said that you are not a neocon, but I mean sometimes words betray you. You refer to the project that smacks the project for this century, the American project for this century. That is smacks of the project for the new century, which brought us that little, not so splendid war in Iraq and all the other things. Maybe you are just a conservative, I think, in the same vein as
I don't even think I qualify as one of those.
Or because of that of Prince Metternich, which brings me to the point.
He's Irving Kristol's descendant, right?
Don't you think that there is a risk of trying to keep that quote-unquote world restored until eternity? I mean, why don't we bring back that Kennedy historian? I think he's still at Yale or Stanford. I think it's for Kennedy, the rise and fall of the big powers. Don't you think that the U.S. is too overstretched, in particular this first decade of the millennium actually took it to further levels, to Spaniard levels in the Netherlands, and it will be just slow, just our ancestors, the Spaniards, and maybe Iraq was their Netherlands, and I don't know who were the ones who defeated them, but will you comment on that?
Sure. Well, for a couple of things. One, just because you use words like America, century, and project doesn't mean you agree with everyone else who uses those words. And when I speak about the American project, I have absolutely no intention to refer to this production of one think tank. It's kind of an attempt to look at the long sweep of American history and look at the patterns that we've seen. I don't think the neoconservatives succeed in explaining that very well. But if you want to, you know, the broader question of, you know, is America overextended and does it face decline? One never knows, of course, you know, at the time. In the 1970s or 1980s, when Paul Kennedy published his book on decline, there was this large sense that Japan was passing the United States, West Germany was passing the United States, the Soviet Union was making gains in the Cold War. Obviously, the period of decline was upon us, and it turned out, of course, not to be. Now, again, we are hearing this. Maybe these voices are right this time. Maybe they're wrong. We'll have to wait and see. But it is interesting, though, to look at the defense budget as a percentage of GDP. Even after 9/11, it's significantly smaller than it was during the whole Cold War. So it's hard to, so that if the U.S. is facing questions of overextension in terms of financial commitments to the military overseas, it's hard to argue that a greatly swollen military budget is the cause. One might argue that the U.S. may face a different kind of overextension, which is overextension of a welfare state at home. I mean, this is part of, I think, what is driving the urgency of President Obama's effort to reform health care, is to look at the long-term fiscal implications of Medicare. And that basically, given the fact that Americans seem determined to grow older, and that scientists seem determined to continue making new discoveries, it's getting more expensive to treat each American, and they're getting to be more older ones. So if you look at the percentage of the federal budget, it's the percentage spent on health care that is exploding, and is the root cause, much more than Social Security, by the way, of any fiscal anxieties about the future. So, it's almost the reverse of Paul Kennedy's thesis. That is to say that if the U.S. is overextended, it's overextended at home. But even then, I think the question would be, can the U.S. reinvent itself? Can it come up with new ways of managing health care and other domestic issues so that over time we can be a better society in an economically sustainable way?
I want to agree with what Walter has just said, and for those of you who are students interested in this topic, I would suggest that you look at two resources. One is to go to the website of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. Walter and I were talking about Pete, a truly remarkable American. Was chairman, I guess, of the Council on Foreign Relations for almost 20 years.
I used to joke he served almost as many terms as Robert Mugabe.
Yeah. But anyway, Pete has created a foundation taking $1 billion of his own money to try and drive change in precisely the areas that Walter's talking about, where we are overextended domestically, and that's in healthcare, the triple budget deficits that we have, and also entitlement reform. And then I would suggest you look at my own organization's website, CED, Committee for Economic Development. Some of the points that we've made around healthcare are exactly this, that we are overextended, we have made promises that we cannot keep, and that we are basically bankrupting ourselves. So we'll have to close down some of those foreign bases because we're not going to be able to afford them, quite frankly. Do you want to comment on
one third source would be an excellent English scholar out there that I'm sure you're aware of, which is Niall Ferguson, who has won many prizes, and he indeed kind of argued about Paul Kennedy's analysis, saying that the overextension was domestic, and to make his point and give it an American-French perspective, he took the example of the French Revolution, when we think that this is sometimes overlook the fact that it was a result of social discontent and an exhaustion of the central state financially in France, that sort of led to the events step by step with les États généraux, the general assembly, so to speak, of the kingdom, that triggered the whole process that went off the chart with the revolution thereafter. So that's also a very interesting scholarly source to look at, and I, by definition, concur with what was said. I agree with that.
questions here? Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
So you are.
My name is Eve Karubi. I'm a master's student at the School for International and Public Affairs. I also have a Master's in International Security from Sciences Po. My question is relating again to transatlantic relations and this important relationship in terms of relations with the rest of the world. I missed the beginning of the talk, but I don't think you touched at all on Africa. And I think I'd like to get your opinions on what future there is for Western action in Africa in terms of, the strategic importance against China, in terms of the resources, and in terms of fundamental security and terrorism issues that are coming from instability there. Thank you.
Well, it's an important issue. We haven't talked about it, but it's an important issue in the sense that you can always make the case that French influence is receding and so on, and it's a pity because then the Americans are taking over when in fact the Chinese are kind of close behind, if not a little bit in advance in some areas, in some aspects of the well, time change, that's the way it is. But that goes back to, I think, if you put the African issue into a more global perspective, or what are the hot zones where Western, again, approach, notwithstanding the competition for all resources, but Western cooperation is needed in order to foster, maintain, or create peace and stability in these regions. The main driver, I believe, for African-American relations, especially in Western Africa, is the diversification of all resources from the Americans. Not only their supplies, but the supply of the world market in order to assuage the possible shocks created by events in the Middle East. And the second one being, of course, in some of the regions, the terrorists' gray zones, if you wish, are out of control. Now, what will be the balance between American influence there and the Chinese one, driven totally by, of course, the need for natural resources? It is the same in Latin America, in fact. Something to be seen in the coming years, but I must say that the U.S. government has not laid forward a particularly comprehensive strategy for Africa yet. I think it might be like in other areas, for instance, the strategic dialogue with China, continuity that will prevail from the W. Bush administration and the Obama one in that respect, despite the fact that the president is what we know he is.
And I think it's an interesting question that you raise, partly because it is clear that Africa is rising in the calculus of U.S. foreign relations and in the priorities given. Aid to Africa, I think, tripled under George W. Bush, interestingly with strong support from the right as well as the left. And this, I think, I think this is one of the places where American society as a whole, while there's sort of differences of approach and strategy, the sense that we both, for reasons of interest and for humanitarian purposes, we need to do more in Africa is very much with us. I would agree that the oil on the West is an important flashpoint. So are the questions of terrorism, many of which tend to be more in the East, although it ranges. It's one thing that I think people often underestimate in Africa is the importance of religious ties between Americans and Africans. That's not only true of African Americans. I spoke to recently the head of the largest African American religious denomination who had just ordained 14 bishops in his church in Nigeria. And he said in the past our bishops in Nigeria were U.S.-born African Americans. Now we're changing, the new 14 are all Nigerians. So they're developing a more autonomous church. But at the same time, I spent a week with Rick Warren, the evangelical leader in Rwanda, visiting with him a lot of the projects that his local church in California has been inaugurating. And thousands of members of Rick Warren's church have visited Rwanda over the last 5 years as part of a very quiet, below-the-radar kind of, and these people range from people making literally their first trip outside the United States to people who are actually working to build all kinds of agricultural development programs and so on, have a certain international experience. I think we're seeing a very, very much a tightening of the personal and the emotional bonds between individual Americans and Africans. We're also seeing NGOs and other groups forming much deeper links. And this is actually one of the most important things that's going on that one rarely sees anything about in the media. And over time, this, I think, will have growing political consequences. And in terms of Chinese influence in Africa, personally, I see in that almost no threat to American interests in any way. China is the world's manufacturer. It makes very great sense that Chinese manufacturing firms would seek to integrate their supply chain just as all other manufacturing firms have done throughout history. If we take seriously Robert Zellick's idea, and I do, that the only way forward in the world is for China to become a responsible stakeholder in the international system, it's going to have to learn to do that. This does not descend like a dove from heaven, and suddenly one day one is illuminated. It comes through a process of practice and experience. So the Chinese invest in copper mines in some third world country, Africa or Latin America. And originally they do it from a sheer commercial point of view, and they try to run their copper mines to get the most copper for the least money, and, in the normal grasping way. Then suddenly they discover that they're in a political context. Maybe there are trade unions. Maybe there are government ministers who are causing trouble. There are changes in government. There are tribal areas. Suddenly the Chinese are now having to, and these are large fixed investments which the local government can cause enormous trouble with at any moment. So suddenly the Chinese are in that whole maelstrom of politics. They presumably will try some things early on in their experience that are, many of us would say, are paths that we in the West have tried and rejected, ultimately as unsustainable. Well, the Chinese cannot just take our knowledge, so they're going to have to learn their own way. Africa is where a lot of this learning will take place. And it seems to me it's a fundamental U.S. interest for China to learn these lessons. Africa seems the place appointed by Providence for them to do it. And I don't see any great threat there to either U.S. economic or political interest. Now, the question that many people raise, and it's a serious one, is will the Chinese commercial concerns undermine the efforts of humanitarian NGOs and other groups in the West? And I think this is a problem. But again, I think this reflects realities, not some artificial action by the Chinese. And it's part of what we're all going to, this is part of the process by which China needs to become integrated into the international system. And China may find out what it's like to have your copper companies targeted by every boycotting, publicity-seeking, political wrangling NGO in the world. I say, great, let them learn. And let them come to realize, as Western interests rather belatedly have done, that it's much better to be proactive in these matters and to take a sensible, relatively enlightened approach from the start. It's in the long run, that's cheaper and more rational.
Yeah, because drawing an analogy with the soft and the hard power of Joe Nye, I'd say there is the hard and the soft integration of China, in the sense that if you think that straightening up institutions in Africa is the interest of the United States, then the commercial interests of China in Africa do not work in favor of American ambitions and American objectives. I'd say that the tribal, cultural, political, historical situation in Africa is so complicated that the circumscribed developments of church-to-church missions requiring others in Africa is a reality. It is something that is circumscribed. I don't see it having, it's debatable, but that of a major political consequence, at least in the foreseeable future, maybe later than that. I think more immediately and in the medium term is the competition of interests and the indifference of the Chinese because of where they come from and where Americans and other Westerners come from to the future of politics, states, and society in Africa. I think they may well respond to, and I totally also, as like you, take Zidik's approach to U.S.-China relations very seriously, the responsible stakeholder. I think the Chinese have shown that already to a decent measure. But I think if they may give out of, on some accounts, like international institutions, financial crisis, remember Asia in '97, right? They didn't do it again. More recently, and a number of other aspects, maybe tomorrow Iran, for instance. If they may give out to the Westerners and the Americans in particular what they expect as a tangible response to their integration as a responsible stakeholder, they might as well not respond on other accounts, such as Africa, and I guess there will be little response from the Westerners on that. So I see rather a murky future for Africans.
We have
I think that would be a common view.
We're going to do
for
one
Africa.
quick question, and we're close to adjourning at 2. Yes, ma'am. You have the last question.
My name is Shoshana Witches, and I go to Barron College. I guess my question is twofold. I want to know, why is it that the rise of the Asian voices is a threat to Europe's standing in the world? And if it is a threat, then wouldn't it be better for Europe to shift its attention from forming a relationship with America and probably focusing on a region like Africa, where it already has a history and it can kind of like renew the relations? Because I mean, when I think of George W. Bush putting billions of dollars into Africa, yes, he did, but a lot of that money went to abstinence-only education. It went to a lot of development programs that actually did not work. So if Europe's standing is going to be compromised by this rise of Asian voices, isn't it better for Europe to shift its focus and start a new relationship with Africa, or even start a new relationship with Asia, where it can really work as a partner and not necessarily as, you know, like the U.S. works very often like a hegemon telling everyone else what to do?
I wouldn't say necessarily that the rise of Asia is a threat to Europe, but I think politics, it's about survival. And when I mentioned that I don't believe in the clash of civilizations, in fact, public leaders in Europe do not buy the argument. In fact, they should finance think tanks, like a think tank, for instance, in order to come out with new ideas and new paradigms. I think we're facing a clash of prosperities. Prosperity means, you know, sustaining your own society, protecting it, and that's what it is about. That is to say, the struggle for survival for society. So they have to adapt. In that sense, I wouldn't say it is an immediate threat or threat at all. It's just there is a global rebalancing act, and the Europeans have to take stock and make what it takes and think about what it takes in order to adapt themselves to, in many ways, education, investments, international relations and treaties, for instance. Welcoming these countries, goes back to the G8 issue, into the playing, just like Yannick said it, playing the responsible stakeholder card with them and come up with a strategy for them. That's point number one. Point number two about Africa, the point is we're running out of money. I mean, just like the U.S. is overextended domestically, we are the same. In fact, Western, in that sense, Japan is included, industrial societies are just facing the same issues. Demographics is the underlying beast, if you will, that is never mentioned, but that is critical to the future. And therefore, as far as I can tell from a French perspective, the point is lots of criticism on the ancient ways of dealing with Africa, good or bad. I think the responsibilities are shared, and two, we're running out of money, so you have to have priorities and reorder your priorities.
Why not? I think all parts of the world, all countries need to think about how do they handle their relationships in a world where the Atlantic is no longer the center of world politics. And it certainly means that Europeans, as Yannick said, need to think more about Europe's approach to Asia and to Africa. I'm not sure that, Europe would find the past a particularly pleasant way to build on its relations with Africa, in the sense that whether it's the colonial regimes before the 1960s or some of the other relationships that have existed since then, there's been at least as much bitter as sweet from an African standpoint there. And it's not clear that the countries that enjoy the closest relationships with Europe have the most prosperity or the best governance in Africa. Perhaps especially in Francophone Africa, though certainly not exclusively. So it's a complicated question, but it's probably true. I think underlying Yannick's point is that there's going to be less discretionary money in the foreign policies of all the countries. And it's going to be for development money, as you pointed out, many of Bush's initiatives haven't worked. Unfortunately, the truth is that ever since World War II, most of the development money that's gone to Africa has utterly failed to generate anything worthwhile. And the Cold War gave sort of a reason for giving money to Mobutu, even though he was going to be promoting democracy and development in Switzerland rather than in Zaire, with the money. And Swiss democracy is flourishing. But you know, now it's going to be more difficult, and you know, Africa and its partners are going to have to find new rationales and new ways of moving forward. But I do think that there is an interest, a continuing commitment in the U.S., I can't speak for Europe, on trying to find a way to make things work better.
We are at the hour of adjournment, and I want to thank our two speakers who have just been really superb. Excuse me, I want to thank all of you for coming, and on behalf of the Maison Française and the French American Foundation, I know they join in thanking you. There's lots to be continued. Those of you who are students in your classes, I hope you will take this information and continue to talk about it. It's been